We have our next speaker is ready to come up. Kicking our afternoon, we have Dr. Stephanie Campbell presenting pitfalls of old school parenting, compassionate caregiving strategies to to counteract colonial influences. Dr. Campbell is a licensed psychologist who serves as a crisis liaison and community trainer for the Hawaiʻi Department of Health and Adolescent Mental Health Division. Please welcome Dr. Stephanie Campbell.
And she plays the trombone. I play the trombone. Stop it. Oh my gosh. Yeah, our daughter's going to be doing the trombone. And my dad and my niece. Look at this. Trombone. It's so funny. Oh my gosh. Who? Nelson. Oh my gosh. Nelson. I knew. Yes. Okay. Trombone. All right. I will go check. Oh, I got it. Does that work? Yep. Okay.
Great. Well, let me go backwards. Hi, everyone. I will do my best to keep you awake in that post-lunch slump, but I'm really grateful to be here. As part of my work with CAMHD, I do mostly actually things involving like supervision and training. I have a few direct clients myself, but one thing that I'm really passionate about is working either directly with families or working with students as they learn to work with families, specifically around a particular caregiving intervention, but also other supports that we can give. So I'll be sharing some skills from that, as well as some historical context. And so to start out with some of that historical context, I would like to just, take my notes up real quick. Okay, so before we really dive in, I want to acknowledge that every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and others have been on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect across all barriers of heritage and difference. And so I want to participate in that and start by honoring the truth that we're on the ancestral lands of the Hawaiian Kingdom and acknowledge that Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani yielded this kingdom and their territories under duress and protest the United States to avoid the bloodshed of her people. I want to give us a second to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. All right, so as an introduction, I'll give you a little bit more context of where some of this is coming from. This is me, but also this was developed particularly in collaboration with Dr. Alexandria King, who is also a psychologist with the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division. And then part of the presentation today, I'll be sharing the research of Akoni Kanaile, who works with Hale Kipa, incredible clinician working on about to get her doctorate, but she particularly focuses on the influences of colonization on child rearing practices here in Hawaii. And so I'll start with a small request to have gentleness with yourself and others. I put this in all my presentations because shame, blame, and guilt are barriers to equity. It's okay when tough feelings come up, but when those feelings come up and become a wall, it's really hard for us to keep learning and listening. So honoring anything that comes up and approaching disagreement with curiosity. All right, so I'll start with a little bit of history, and I need to hear some answers, so feel free to shout out loud and I'll try to repeat them. What comes to mind when you hear old school parenting? Spanking, lickings.
Do what you're told, not what I do.
Do what you're told, not what I do. Good clarification.
Children should be seen and not heard.
Seen and not heard.
Tough love.
What was that one?
Tough love.
Tough love?
Tough love.
Tough love, sorry. Yeah, great. Yeah, awesome. Anything else? Totally on board with everything that we've noticed as well. That traditional or old school caregiving, when people say it, and they kind of say it like matter of fact, right? I've worked with dozens and dozens of families in this local community, and people will sometimes start with, well, I'm an old school parent, and you kind of are expected to know what that is, and generally people do, right? It's things that usually means they really value discipline and accountability. They really value respect for adults and elders and authority, and they really value obedience. And none of those are bad things, right? I mean, necessarily. Right? We also work on discipline. We work on respect. But it's all about kind of the proportion of how we're focusing and prioritizing some of these things that can make a really big difference in the kids' experience. We also see use of, as immediately mentioned, physical discipline, so lick-ins. And someone said tough love, toughen up techniques. I think this is an important one because it comes from a really good intention. I never want to shame and blame a parent who thinks that they care for their child, they want their child to succeed in a cold, tough, hard world out there. So they think, if I'm tough on you now, if I make things hard, I get you ready and I get you tougher so that you can then go out and face this cold, hard, tough world and be more successful, ideally. It makes a lot of sense logically, and it doesn't align very well with trauma-informed care principles. We also see use of authoritarian or strict approach. What I mean by authoritarian is like, I'm right and you're wrong, I'm big and you're small, that whole Matilda dialogue of the parent, the caregiver, is always the one who kind of holds the correct answer or approach in all circumstances. And then this is so interesting and continues to be true. I have asked this, I can't tell you, probably hundreds of people. I asked them the same question I just asked you, but what comes to mind with old school caregiving, and no one has ever actually said out loud, men less involved in child rearing. And I'm a little bit encouraged by that because I'm like, maybe that's not top of mind for us right now, which is good to hear. It means maybe more people are participating. However, we do still see somewhat division of labor kind of overall as a population, that a lot of times if it is a heterosexual couple, that the woman sometimes has this invisible labor or more of the burden of some of these things, but at least it's not the first thing folks are noticing. Okay. But here's what I really want to underline, and part of the thesis of this whole talk is that old school techniques are actually not that old, and they aren't aligned with traditional Hawaiian child rearing practices, and not just Hawaiian, other cultural groups that call Hawaii home. And for sake of example, I want to share a little bit about my background. I'm the daughter of a Filipino immigrant and a person from rural Arkansas. And that was a fascinating combination growing up in rural Arkansas as the only immigrant people, the only brown family, essentially. But I've come to learn a lot later in life things that how Filipinos and our culture was affected by colonization as well. In grad school, I learned that white folks came and basically did experiments in schools and thought that if they could teach Filipino children to hold their bodies a certain way and act a certain way, they can like civilize them, as you might have heard with things like the schools that people would get shipped off to back in the day when they thought that Native Americans also needed to be civilized. And that's not just happened here, it's happened all globally. Australia, Canada, US. Colonization has a long and deep history of thinking they can tell everyone else how to treat their children. But the thing that was shocking to me was they came to the Philippines, this was probably back in like the 40s, 50s, and said, you're touching your children too much. Don't touch them that much. You're breastfeeding too much. Why are you breastfeeding your children? Because at the time, there was some kind of thinking at some level that those things were not good. And now looking back, we're like, oh gosh, that's kind of bad advice. Like, it's actually good to hold and touch your children. It's good. It's not a bad thing to breastfeed either. So it's kind of this thinking of like, there's one right way. That's a tenet of white supremacy culture. There's only one right way to do things. And so we see these ripple effects throughout. And we'll come back to a little bit about how my history also overlaps with this. But first I want to share Akoni Kanaile's research. And I want to clarify, too, that this isn't meant to say that before everything was a perfect utopia and then after it wasn't. That's not at all what this message is. The message is specifically in the category of child rearing, specifically in how families related to children, there were some observed changes that we can see through history and documentation. So I want to clarify that because it's been a little contentious and confusing in other settings, that it's not meant to say there was never strife and war and whatever before. It's just that specifically with child rearing and learning, there were some changes. And so Western contact, a lot more focus on communal living, fluid relationships, collective experiences, and all ages sharing makua and kupuna responsibilities. So this, like the whole village, that we still say this, takes a village to raise a child, but it was really, really baked in. Whereas after that, we see some changes where more focus on the nuclear family, so less of the connections with the other more distant relatives, perhaps, like on the day-to-day, kind of less support overall, and less time with kupuna. Child rearing, and this is kind of a sign of the times too, became more of like the mother's duty, and women and children were more seen as property than they were before. Her research also taught us that experiential learning, we think about how learning changed. Experiential learning was very important, observation more than just being questioned, the storytelling and having mo'olelo be a part of education for kids. Nonverbal cues and gestures were valued, and kids really encouraged to be self-reliant, collaborative, and respectful. And again, not to say that this doesn't happen now, there were just some really post-contact changes. But the idea was we want to be harmonious with all, with the land, with our families, with our ancestors, honoring the past and preparing for the future. Some of the changes that happened after, though, I already mentioned one tenet of white supremacy culture, which is one right way. Another is quantity over quality and worship of the written word. So this is when we see some of the there's also goes along with some of the stamping out of trying to eliminate Hawaiian cultural practices, right? They don't see the value of things like hula and mo'olelo when they think there's only one way to talk about history. There's this idea that children should obey without question. And a lot of that kind of has to do with some of the religious morals that came around the same time, with a disregard for the connections between the Aina and the people. And lastly, some changes in discipline, and this is where I'll focus a little bit more of my time, is that traditional ideas about children focus more on like verbal explanations and exclusion as a last resort. So trying everything else before excluding a child. So things like discussing with a priest, diet changes, exercise, massage, different things to try to help when there's behavior issues. And physical abuse was strictly prohibited because young children were considered to be spiritually linked to deceased ancestors. After that, along with many traditions worldwide that were affected by kind of Western contact, ideas about children changed. I shared a couple of examples before, but one that I find that people still believe, and I'm talking people my age who are educated, sometimes still believe, is that kids are just little adults. And they're not. They're just not the same. They're not a tiny-sized grown-up. They're their whole own beautiful whole thing that helps for us to better understand, because when we can better understand them, we can then be more patient in some ways about their limitations. I think, who was it? I don't know if Erica or Johanna said it earlier, but I heard kind of a gasp when people were like, your brain's not really fully cooked until you're almost 30. And that's one of the things I can't shut up about. I tell parents and caregivers and providers all the time, brains are not fully developed until between probably 25, 28, even the later 30, like early 30s for some people, depending, right? Upper 20s is when you can say you have a fully cooked brain. And before that, Jello brain. That's kind of how I explained it. And I used to tell my little brother, who's 8 years younger than me, like, you have Jello brain. You can't tell me anything about this. But it really stuck with him, and he actually changed some of the decisions he made in like high school because I told him so many times how Jello his brain was. But when we see the effects of missionary ideas about children, someone had mentioned, like, I think spare the rod, spoil the child kind of thing, and physical discipline as a means to enact control, which has the same imperialist efforts of other places, including the places that relate to my background, the Philippines and the South. So, big point about physical discipline is that just because it's normal doesn't mean it's helpful. And groups with connections to colonization and slavery are much, much, much more likely to use physical discipline. I give myself as an example because on one side of my family I have colonization, on the other side of my family I have the rural South, which has a lot of influence of human enslavement. And so there was no universe in which I wasn't getting hit as a child. And people say sometimes things like, well, you turned out fine, right? You're a doctor. And I'll speak a little bit more to that in a second, because in some ways, yes, and asterisk other things as well. But what I find is that providers are often unwilling to discuss this because of fear of making offense or their own discomfort with it or just not knowing, or they just think it's normal. But again, just because it's normal doesn't mean it's helpful. First got really into this in grad school when I was working in a school, a middle school, where it was predominantly Black and brown children and predominantly white staff. And I noticed some things. They did so many efforts to be culturally responsive. They really cared about this in their practices as a school. And then there were topics that would come up where I'm like, no one will touch it with a 10-foot pole. I thought that was really curious that no one even wanted to talk about physical discipline or how it might be affecting our kids. And then they had a speaker come to that same school and tell us about this direct connection between physical abuse and human enslavement. It was a Black professor who came to talk and say, we call it like post-traumatic slave syndrome, of passing on these means of control that were taught and forced upon our people. Not to say that only Black families do that, right? A lot of other families do too. And I wonder if you have this own experience in your life as well, can you trace your history back to either slavery or colonization? But kids who are physically disciplined have similar reactions to those who have childhood trauma. And Dr. Kaleka said this earlier as well. He talked briefly when he was talking about the ACEs about kids getting hit or beat. The way I think it's worded in the ACEs study was like hit very hard or leave a mark or something. But those are just like ways to ask a question to try to say where you hit, like really hit, when you don't have to like really get hit for this to have an effect. It's not the difference of does it leave a bruise, but imagine if you're just a kid who thinks everyone's getting lick-ins. It's normal, all my friends do, I get lick-ins, whatever. But imagine having those same traumatic responses as a child who was neglected or sexually abused. And that's what we see. We see that these kids have a lot more externalizing behaviors. And there's a whole group of folks like in psychology who are really advocating for physical discipline to be categorized as an ACE. Because right now we say physical abuse, and there's like a real blurry line for people, the difference between physical abuse and physical discipline, which if you're a mandated reporter, sometimes you have to wrestle with that line. But when adults hit children, they model that it is okay and acceptable to do that. And of course, Keiki are gonna follow that. We don't typically solve other interpersonal problems with hitting. So if I disagree with a colleague, I have a colleague from CAMHD in the audience. If Madeline and I disagreed and I slapped her, that would be super weird. We would call that assault. However, when this happens in a home with a child, we say that's discipline. So why is that the difference? Why is it assault if I hit you, but not if I hit my child? And I feel like we maybe should interrogate that question a little harder, because it's not that families don't know. I work with plenty of families who say, I had such an old school upbringing. And they might still have some of those kind of thinking patterns, but they even tell me, they say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to hit my kid. I just don't know what else to do. So people do feel stuck sometimes. Okay, this is where I have my good friend Richard. Thank you so much for the help.
Someone commented on one of my previous videos and said, I hit my kids and they're doctors now. And we have to understand that good parenting is not measured by the college they get into or the job that they have. Do you know how many people with traumatic childhoods have great jobs and lots of accomplishments? The goal of parenting shouldn't be to create doctors and lawyers. We should put more focus on teaching children to create build and maintain meaningful relationships. We should put more focus on teaching children to understand themselves and their needs and to meet their needs in a healthy way. We should put more focus on helping children hone the skills of empathy, perspective taking, problem solving. But hey, they're a doctor or lawyer, they may not be able to afford the time, but hopefully they can afford a good therapist that will help them spend the rest of their lives healing from the adults that hit and shamed them as a means of control.
So I'll go back to this example of I turned out fine. And it's not important in the specifics, but I'll tell you right now from my own personal experience, there are things I did not have to suffer through in my earlier years, in my earlier adult years, that were a result of being hit as a child. And I can speak for my family members too, who are successful and brilliant, but they have things going on that their anger is triggered in a certain way that becomes very big, very fast. And I see it as almost, they don't see it as a trauma reaction because they don't feel like they're traumatized. But it's the trauma of being hit repeatedly. I honestly got lucky because I was an incredibly anxious child, so I wanted to just follow the rules and not be in trouble. So I evaded more of it than some of my other family members, but for some kids, I mean, especially like really naturally rambunctious people or whatever, they might have less anxiety keeping them from some of these effects. So maybe it isn't just about the result of where someone lands, right? Maybe it is all about the journey on the way, not to be overly cheesy, but I think, we have to consider that there are probably more impacts than we realize. I'll keep going. Someone let me know if that change isn't behind me. Give me 1 sec. Oh, here we go. Okay. So this is the reflection I encourage. Thank you, Richard. Why do I do this? Or a reflection we can use with families we work with, or people people in your life. What am I trying to accomplish by using physical discipline? Can I trace that practice back to colonization and/or slavery? And most importantly, does this practice reflect my core values? I have asked countless parents, what are your values? What matters to you as a parent? What's important to your family? And not one time has anyone ever said, I want my child to fear me. No one says that. People care about their kids and don't have this kind of top of mind thing of, I want them to be afraid. Those parents who actually feel that way probably aren't seeking help from a therapist. But the ways that they use behavior management are communicating to the child, I want you to fear me, which is a very different relationship and not aligned with our core values. And one cool thing about your values is by doing things aligned with your values, it actually prevents burnout way better than taking a vacation or a self-care day, just doing work aligned with your values. For those of you who have ever had a job where you're like, ooh, I don't really care for this, but I'm doing it because it's a job, and you feel exhausted and more burnt out, that's why. It's because when we work in disalignment from our core values, straight to burnout. And so I think about that with parenting because these parents are already tired. We don't have time to be doing things not aligned with our core values. Okay, here we go. So I just want to offer a resource. I would encourage you to check out the No Hit Zone. These are some, you can just Google it, but they have all these very specific handouts, tips for parents across the age range. So from infant all the way to age 18, there's probably like 6 or 7 different age divisions. And it tells you like, what's an example of like talking back or breaking house rules. Instead of saying, you're going to be punished if you're late again, you could say something like, I worry when you aren't home at the time that you said you're going to be, what makes it difficult to be home on time? So it literally has like what to say instead of what people might be saying and gives great resources on positive behavior management strategies. Speaking of those, let's talk about them now. So if we're trying to replace the practice of physical discipline, what can we do instead? Compassionate caregiving, and I want to show you how this is a little different than what we think of for kind of old school caregiving. But first I want to start with why traditional strategies aren't really working. part of it is we just know a lot more about how things function, right? We know that kids aren't tiny adults. We know that trauma is a thing and matters, and especially complex and intergenerational trauma. So complex trauma is the kind where it's like that interpersonal kind of day-to-day, like abuse every day, like an emotional abusive situation, that would be complex. Living in poverty, that's a complex trauma. Intergenerational and historical trauma also matter. So we weren't really thinking about that before when we first started kind of thinking trauma existed. At first, trauma was thought to be exclusive to people who fought in a war. And we've really expanded our understanding, but I will say, like, I feel like this is very still much in development. And especially learning like things like those positive or the benevolent experiences that Erica talked about. So we know a lot more about child development. We know more about brain functioning and its limitations, back to that Jello brain. And we know that relationship matters. So there is a strong power in a caregiver-child relationship. I also like to try to help parents understand that when it comes down to like these old school techniques, sometimes it just feels like who can hold out the longest, whose will is stronger in this moment. And sometimes it's the child's, right? But trying to just battle and hold out longer than the other person is really tiring. It's more tiring than it is helpful. And again, underlining how it doesn't communicate your core values. And people do say obedience. When I ask people their values, sometimes people say obedience, and sometimes they say respect. I try to put a little reframe on it, and I was like, okay, you want them to respond to instructions and commands, because when we think obedience as a concept, it's kind of like listen to me or else, when there's a little bit of risk to that, and I'll get to that in a second. But so what do we mean by compassionate caregiving? This is not permissiveness. It's not the kid in charge. It's not them running all over the family. It's not trying to be happy all the time, and it's not like a lack of consequences. Consequences are super important for kid learning and behavior. It's probably not what you see on social media. If you've ever fallen into the parenting side of the social media algorithm, you might see things about quote unquote gentle parenting. And I would say sometimes those things are aligned with good practice, and many times it's actually not. And it's not rooted in whiteness and white culture. Sometimes when you talk about a thing that feels like contrary to what someone's individual family has done, they kind of respond, well, that's white people stuff. And it's actually not that. It turns out the whitest thing you can do is to hit your child. Back to that colonization and slavery thing. And interestingly, that's actually pretty motivating for people. They're like, wow, it really is. So if that helps. And then it's not selfish to be compassionate. It's not focused on just being friends. So what is it actually? Compassionate caregiving is strengths-based, not fear-based. It's effective, positive communication that rewards good behaviors and choices. And more importantly, it really emphasizes the praise of good choices more than it emphasizes the discipline and consequence of bad behaviors. And so this is part of how I would encourage folks to reframe, is teaching Keiki to be thoughtful, independent people in the world. They're a person in development. They're an adult on their way to adulthood without being an adult, right? Not simply to follow or obey. So if a kid is in a home where all they're taught is you obey or else, they are much more susceptible to things like peer pressure, abusive relationships in the future, because they don't know how to make those positive choices. They only know that there's consequences if I don't. And it helps build resilience to keep them safe as they enter their more independent part of their lives. Compassionate caregiving also has to come within an understanding of trauma and context. How is everything else going on affecting what's going on with parenting, and how might trauma be playing a role? So one thing to think about is reacting versus responding. When we react to something, it's kind of like in the moment, whereas if we respond to something, the idea of being a little more thoughtful about how I'm going to respond in certain situations. So I'll try to give some examples of this as we go. But one example is how, if we're teaching about safety, so I worked with a 5-year-old kid once who ran into the road constantly. So he was actually going into a busy road. It was actually a pretty dangerous situation. The parent felt kind of desperate about this. And I'm going to use that as an example, which is if we're teaching about safety, we don't want that kid to run into the road. We could yell at the child and say, never do that again. We could use physical discipline. And this is kind of either fear-based, and what I mean by fear is not just the kid's fear, the parent is afraid of what's gonna happen to the child. Oops. Okay. Potential reasoning is if I yell at the kid, they know I'm serious. And if I scare them, they'll remember this moment and they won't do it again. So the logic is there, right? There's a good reason people do these things. Not that the thing itself is good. So in this example, pain now is better than potential pain later or death. If I hit you for running in the road, you're gonna remember not to do that and you won't die for running in the road. Or they did wrong, they didn't listen, and they need some kind of punishment, so they learn to listen in the future. That's the potential reasoning behind those actions. But what's actually behind that for the parents? It's a deep love for the child. They love and care for their child, and also worry, fear, and anxiety. It's very scary when a 5-year-old is running into a street repeatedly, right? At the core of this, it's I care about you and your safety. I want you to be safe. And that might be deeply internal. The parent might not even articulate that, but that's what's kind of going on. Let me give a counterexample of compassion-based. We could instead set up rules in advance or explain consequences and what you mean by safe, if you're worried about safety. So setting up rules in advance, the rule is when you play, you can't go past this tree in the yard. And if you go past the tree, this will happen. If you stay safe in the yard, you can continue to play. If you go past the tree, you no longer can play outside, something like that. If you outline expectations clearly, using child-appropriate language, something simple within their developmental age, they will understand exactly what behaviors you want to see. And this is also much more aligned with trauma-informed care, where it's structured, consistent, clear. Trauma feels like chaos when it happens to you. It comes out of nowhere most times. So when kids feel a sense of chaos in the way the parent is responding, that can actually trigger a trauma reaction. So the opposite of that is to be super clear in advance. We're talking about things up front. This other side here is to explain consequences and what you mean by safe. That's part of trauma-informed care too, and it helps them to learn what you actually mean by safe. Safety is meaning your body stays in a place where you don't get hurt. So, going to move to some actual, and I guess I want to point one more thing out actually. The same reasoning can be true for that second parent, is that they have a deep love for their child, they have worry, fear, and anxiety, they want them to be safe. This is just a totally different way of approaching that. All right, so overall, you may have heard this said before, but it's such an important part of trauma-informed and responsive care, is that healing happens in relationship. The harm can happen in the relationship too, and the healing can as well, even for offending parents. And so these are kind of 4 big areas of things you can think about when it comes to compassionate ways to respond. Creating structure, being consistent, growing understanding, and developing a sense of agency. So I accidentally said this one early, but trauma is chaotic, and so we want to have a structure that will help us avoid having to react. It allows us to respond based on what we said we were going to do. And the consequences should always be clear and never be a surprise. When we think about consistency, we want them to do what they say, to follow through on the thing that they promise. So here's an example. I teach parents about consequences and say, if you have a trip planned to Disneyland, don't say, do this or you're going to lose Disneyland. You already bought the tickets. You're not about to take Disneyland away. So that's an unrealistic consequence. And it's like, sometimes people use these big things because they think it'll be more effective, but kids are pretty smart. Kids are wily, and they couldn't know that, or they know that you already don't follow through on what you say, so it's less effective. Saying things like, you're gonna lose 30 minutes of screen time is something that you can do, And you can take that away over and over again, right? You can add and subtract screen time all day. I try to explain consequences as a currency. You don't want to spend it all in one place, right? So it's actually not necessary to take something away a whole day or even a half day. For many kids, and especially young kids, you can take something away for 15 minutes, a preferred toy or 10 minutes of like bedtime or something. Those things are like $0 as a reward or consequence, and you can spend them over and over again. And so with consistency, building trust is a really important part of this because it can have ripple effects. If there's trust between it doesn't even have to be a caregiver. I keep saying caregiver, but any kind of adult that's supportive for the child. Like having that trust can have really long ripple effects. We see in the research that even kids with like really tough situations, if they have one solid adult in their life, their outcomes can be totally different. And someone said this earlier, but that could be you, right? You could be that kid or that person in that kid's life. All right, growing understanding. So when we understand trauma, child development, what's reasonable, what's kind of maybe less reasonable as an option, we can then feel more prepared in those difficult situations, but also be more patient in those situations. And when we lack understanding, we can accidentally make the situation more difficult or way worse. So some examples. Here we go, back to this again, can't say it enough. Keiki brains are different than adult brains, and when we expect them to respond like an adult, we're setting ourselves up for failure. So all of it is like, how do I set myself up for possible better success? And so one thing that has had a shocking effect with parents after I learned this skill myself is that waiting 5 seconds after a request or a command. And the reason behind that is it might be longer than 5 seconds depending on developmental level, but 5 seconds is a great place to start. And 5 seconds is probably longer than you think. So right now I'm gonna be quiet for 5 full seconds and see how that feels to you. So if I tell you, please put on your shoes. That was 5 seconds. So I don't know how that felt to you, but it probably feels different than how some people give a command and respect a response. I knew that was my household growing up, right? If they gave a command, it was like immediate or else. And it's just not appropriate for kids' brains. They need that 5 full seconds to like hear the information, chew on the information, do something with their body. And I can't tell you how many parents have said just that one skill has drastically changed how behaviors are in their house because they're setting them up for more success. Simplifying directions, so even 3 directions, even if they're 3 simple things, that can be too much for many kids. I saw that there was an FASD table out there, which is awesome, from the FASD Action Group. Incredible group of folks. If you're not familiar with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, highly recommend you check them out. But it is one of the most underdiagnosed things with children, I guess with people in general. And often it looks like other things. It looks like ADHD, it looks like autism. So that's why it gets missed frequently. But one thing about FASD is it really affects ability to follow directions. Like it's kind of like a memory thing. They can hear it, fully understand it, but instead of being able to kind of like put that sticky note in their brain, the analogy I use is you thought it was a sticky note, but it's an index card and it just fell down. And so for some kids, if 2 directions in a row is too much, maybe trying 1. And then remember flipped lid. So has anyone ever heard the flipped lid analogy? Hey, okay, probably education people out there, but I'll tell you because it's a really useful one. If you take your hand like this, it's a brain. Imagine this is the front of your brain, and that's the front part, the prefrontal cortex is the part that can like logic, reason, plan, think about the future. And that's the very last part to develop, unfortunately. So when we ask even a high schooler, say a 16-year-old, to think about their future and plan for it, the part of their brain that can do that is not fully cooked and could have at least a decade more until it is. So it's not that kids don't try or don't care. Sometimes it's that they just truly can't physiologically, but we want them to. So we set them up for these situations that are frustrating for us, the adults. But flipped lid analogy is if a kid is dysregulated, their lid is flipped. Their thinking part of their brain is offline, and all we have left is that middle part, which is where fear and emotion center of the brain, the limbic system or the amygdala, is driving the bus. So if the amygdala is driving the bus, we cannot expect a kid to like listen and respond and converse with us. We're setting ourselves up for failure that way. So we have to focus. If the lid is flipped, first thing we have to do is get that lid back down. And the way that we do that is calming, coping, take some breaths, do something else, take a break, because asking them to answer questions and rationalize with you is just it's not gonna work when the lid is flipped. Okay. Sometimes I hear folks say, this kid is just manipulative. They say a lot of things. Sometimes they call their kids like sociopaths and psychopaths and all kinds of stuff that I'm like, okay, let's back up a little bit. But manipulation, the idea of a kid being manipulative, has less to do with what the child did and a lot more to do with what the adult assumes about the child. So if we go in saying this kid is manipulative and bad, they're probably gonna meet that expectation. Because sometimes, and this is important for FASD or other developmental disabilities, kids would often rather look bad than stupid. They'd rather be seen as like, that's a bad kid, rather than be thought to be stupid. So they kind of play into it more. The other option is to slow down, think about the context, what's going on. Supporting the idea. So consider instead, what if we thought about the things that feel like manipulation to actually be, they have an unmet need and they're kind of bad at figuring out how to meet their need. So they're trying to meet their need. Maybe they need regulation, maybe they need attention, maybe they need something very specific, maybe they're hangry, right? But they don't know how to communicate that. They haven't developed those skills. They flip out and throw a chair. And assuming that they're just manipulative or they're trying to like connive again, like to be this genius mastermind against their parent is just unrealistic. They often just need something and they don't know how to get it. It also doesn't mean they always get what they want, of course, but assuming they're manipulative kind of creates a situation where we'll see more negative behaviors. Okay, speaking of needs, kids want and need attention. And sometimes any kind of attention will do. It spends the same, if you will. So if a kid hasn't gotten any attention, they maybe say, they've asked appropriately 3 times, like, can we play? Can we play? The parent's like, no, not right now. No, not right now. Later, we can play later. And then the kid jumps on the table and starts spinning around and the parent says, no, get down. They've suddenly got the attention that they wanted, but they had to go out of their way in like a pretty big negative way to get that attention. So we want to try to flip that and see how can we not respond to those negative behaviors, because that can encourage more of them if that's filling their attention need. Or if a kid has experienced trauma and they need, some kind of relationship feeling because they've had a lot of like troubling stuff happen to them before, they'll do a similar thing. So instead, we can ignore everything we can, which is much easier said than done, and praise positive behaviors, which I think is easier than people think sometimes. And that can look as good as a kid is tantruming. We want to not turn our body towards the kid who's tantruming, keep an eye on them. But if they're just kind of yelling or crying, that's actually not hurting anything. As soon as they take a breath, maybe they just need to breathe because they're crying, we can say, great job taking a breath. And we've praised a step towards regulation. So it's kind of like, can we catch any tiny small thing that's kind of good? If you ask them to clean up and they haven't actually done it, they start walking towards where the stuff is. Thank you for walking towards the direction of the things. A good thank you can actually help a lot more when we can kind of catch them being good, essentially. And having this consistent, positive, child-led time together, we tell parents 5 minutes a day. And you don't get bonus points for extra minutes. I really mean it when I say 5 minutes. Giving a kid 5 minutes can actually help them throughout the rest of the day, because they have that 5 minutes of like quality time, and especially if they're child-led time, they get to be the boss. And for kids who've experienced trauma, having that sense of agency is super, super important. Trauma's out of our control, again, really chaotic. And kids and people need to feel powerful and like they matter. And so they'll fight you at every step of the way to try to feel powerful if they don't have a space for that themselves. So just having 5 minutes of child-led play can do a huge difference. And if it's an older kid and they don't play anymore, 5 minutes of a craft, 5 minutes of something together that they get to choose, huge, huge difference. Okay, these are some of that. And the other one I really encourage folks is choices. You can provide a choice over very silly things. Dinner time, you can sit here or here. Great job making a choice. That was awesome. Doesn't have to be two positives. Can be kids like running around wild on the beach. You can say, you have two choices. You can play more calmly or gently, or you can come take a break, a calm down with me. So just ways we can give them back control and let them lead. This is also easier said than done, but trying to reduce questions and commands, which honestly just end up frustrating kids, and people wonder why they're not answering. It's because maybe it's overwhelming for their brains, or they've already answered 47 questions at school today and they're tired and they just wanna chill or play or do something else. Okay, I think that is the end. But my last tips just before I go is to remember this, that healing from trauma, we wish it looked like this. We wish that after you got care, lovely straight line of progress, but actually it often looks like this and feels like this. It feels chaotic. It feels like progress isn't being made. And I just want, if we know this and we normalize it and we understand it, then we can be more patient with our kids and with ourselves. So thank you so much for your time.
Or did anybody have any questions? Yes?
So you were talking about how the brain develops, and usually their thinking capacity doesn't really happen until their 20s or early 30s. So I was wondering, like, if they have to do, if there's the whole flipped lid part where that's not even capable and it just goes straight to fear, like in an evolutionary sense, like, why would that ever benefit a child?
The flip of the part?
Frustrating parents from the beginning of time?
That's a really good question. It's a physiological response. Like the body keeps the score, what he mentioned earlier this morning. Your body is trying to protect you, and when the fear response activates, it sends you into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop, these like trauma reactions, these anxiety reactions that help keep you alive historically. If a big old giant cat is about to attack you and your fear center of your brain lights up and you can run away, that's very advantageous. However, our bodies are not in that situation anymore, and so we have the same reaction that kept our ancestors alive. Unfortunately, you know, evolution is so slow. It's not really about the frustration part. It's about your body reacting in a way that's meant to keep you alive, even if that fear thing is not a life-threatening situation. That's why we see dysfunction after trauma, right? Because your body and brain is trying to keep you alive, but those reactions aren't helpful in a non-traumatic situation. Does that make sense?
Well, it's just interesting because, you know, 100 million years ago or whatever, you know, you would still be getting chased by a tiger, whether you were 15 or.
Totally. And it's that reaction that they don't really, it's not really about like the orchestration of what had happened before the reaction. It's just like your body reacts before your brain can think about it, kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know it's not a great answer. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Any other questions? You're welcome to reach out to me. I don't know where my contact information is. I'm pretty findable. I'm Stephanie Campbell, a Fat Crit Scholar on social media that I'm not on, but I'm sure you can find me. Okay, thank you, bye.